Hello and welcome to another movie fix and restoration from 00 Productions. We're going right back to 1984 and we're going to review and attempt to fix some of the many problems that exist in this iconic film, Ghostbusters. Now, I was a kid in 1984 and 6 years old, lucky enough to see this movie at the cinema. And I gotta tell you that I've not seen or heard audiences scream and react in the way that they did before or since. The issues mainly come down to special effects and the technology they had available at the time. What we are doing is maintaining the integrity of the original visual effects and doing our best to utilize software to finesse what's already there. So we'll begin with one of the first shots, and these will generally be in chronological order, and that is the establishing shot of Dana Barrett's apartment building. What we see here is essentially a matte painting on top of live action footage. Now, if we have a closer look at the painting, we will notice that there are some pretty heavy matte lines around the edge of the buildings, shown here in white. So we're going to start off by eliminating these as best as possible by using a mask. A mask made up of many hundreds of little points so that we can refine the edge and get it really close to the buildings. And we'll put a soft edge on it as well. Once we've done that, we are also going to utilize the foreground element, which is the park and the trees, because we'll be needing to come back to that later. Next, we take some HD footage of a rather nice skyline, and we're going to add some colour grading into that to match the light and colour of the original shot. We're going to place that in. Now, because it's a matte painting, we need to sharpen this image up a little bit without losing any detail, so we're going to duplicate it and add an overlay, which we are going to sharpen, and then we're going to tweak some of the curves, the brightness, contrast and the levels, just to bring the depth of the buildings out a little more. Bring back the trees, and finally put back the foreground, which we masked off earlier. And here's the end result. And this moves us on to the establishing shot of the Terror Dog statue. Now, because they are generally relying on optical compositing, a technique that was often utilized was to print the composite at a slightly lower opacity. This usually eliminated or certainly cut down the thickness of the matte line around the object itself. The lower opacity comes with its problems, so you can see the road through the teeth, you can see vehicles passing through the statue. To fix this, we're going to go right back to the beginning of the shot, and we're going to utilize a few frames of the statue itself and remove it from the shot entirely. And we're going to color grade it so that it loses its green tinge and becomes more of a grey stone palette. Next, we move on to the shot of Slimer in the hotel scene. This was done by having an actor in a costume of Slimer optically composited onto the shot. So first of all, we need to isolate Slimer, so we'll do that on a frame by frame basis, carefully cutting him out with a soft edge eraser. Then we can tweak the colour so that there's more of a continuity between the more vibrant green in the previous shots and the subsequent shots. And then we can create a new background plate of the door, which has no brightness flickering on it at all. Next, we need to motion track him, because it's our intention to bring out the detail in the face by going back to the original footage shot in the effects studio. I'm going to isolate the face and apply the motion track to it so that it matches the movement of the ghost. Once we've done that, we can composite that on top, and then we can tweak the colour, add a subtle diffuse glow, because after all it is a ghost, it needs to glow, and then we can replace it entirely.
Okay, who brought the dog?
That brings us on to the Terror Dog. Now, problems. The Terror Dog is a stop motion animated model which has been superimposed onto a live action background. The only problem here is it suffers from an opacity problem. It's almost 50% transparent, you can see the background through it, and it loses so much of its detail. It looks more like a plasticine model rather than the Terror Dog. So we're going to go forward through the movie and find an appropriate angle of the Terror Dog's face. We're going to grab a few frames of that, preferably when it's in motion, and we're going to superimpose that. Obviously we've motion tracked it so that there isn't an issue with it following the same trajectory. Next we have an issue with the body. We can still see it's transparent and it's lost a lot of its texture and its details. So we create a PNG file, that's a transparent background image with a skin tone and a couple of the feet. First of all, we place that roughly where it needs to be, and then we're going to utilize a technique called puppet pins. This is a technique where we can actually put joints or pivots, anatomically speaking, where the creature's limb joints would be. By doing this, we can match the stop motion animation and the movement by adding keyframes at various points with the pins, by moving them and tweaking them. On the software, we'll fill in the movement between the keyframes. Now this moves us on to one of the most technically difficult shots to update or clean up, and that mainly came down to the fact that when they were doing these visual effects, they really didn't have enough time.
We would shoot tests and send them over to see if Ivan liked where we were going, and then he just took them, cut them in the movie.
There are some funky shots in Ghostbusters. We just didn't have time to finesse them.
Go on to something else.
It was real intense.
So we go back to the shot itself, and we're going to start by taking a high resolution photographed image of a Terror Dog model, which will split up into its legs and main body. After tracking the motion, we can take our model and apply a range of puppet pins so that we can animate the movement of the creature to match the creature in the original shot. Once we've done that, it's now a case of blending and using motion blur and fixing the levels and the brightness and the contrast, so we get something that looks a little bit more realistic. We can bring it back into Photoshop and we can start tweaking the levels and the color tinting. It needs to be more brown than grey, so we've gone ahead and done that. Then we can use an airbrush and animate plumes of dust, which further covers up the joins, and when we play it back, we should have something that looks slightly more updated, or certainly cleaner. Okay, the subway ghost. Now this is a creepy visual effect, but as with some of the others, it suffers due to the technology used at the time and it being an optical composite of a puppet. One of the big giveaways that it is an optical composite is these large areas of brightness when they composited these things, and you may see this effect in some of the earlier Star Wars films where you see a light semi-transparent box around the model or ship, or in this case, creature. It can be somewhat distracting when you watch the film. So the way in which we've approached this is we need a clean background plate, so we've constructed one using various bits and pieces from the shot itself that hasn't been obstructed by something in the foreground. Once we've done that, we can start manually erasing the areas around the ghost, and the clean background plate will obviously be revealed underneath. We can take our new isolated ghost and we can overlay it on top of itself with increased levels of exposure, which brings out the details in the face, the body, the limbs, the fingers, etc. Next we have our long shot of Marshmallow Man walking down the street with the Ghostbusters in the foreground. What we've got here is a foreground plate of the actors that's been superimposed on top of a miniature set. One of the big disparities though is the difference in colour between their costumes in the previous shot and here in the composited shot. So we're going to basically use a mask to isolate the characters in the foreground, and then we're going to tweak the colour balance and hopefully match the colour tones to the previous shot. Now we have this low angle street scene of Marshmallow Man's foot entering the frame. This is one of the shots that really did suffer because of time. We've got buildings that are shaking all over the place, and there are issues with Marshmallow Man's feet or foot as well. If we zoom in a little, we can see that during the shot the foreground elements of the buildings are shaking left to right, frame by frame, and obviously the top portion of the building was always a matte painting or a model, but it looks odd that Dana's building is shaking underneath the temple. With the foot itself, because of a lower opacity, we can see window frames and windows through it, so we're going to tackle that as well. So we need to start with a clean background plate of the buildings that are not shaking around. So we'll take a few frames of that when it's unobstructed by something in the foreground, and we're going to use that as our background plate. Next we have to isolate the foreground actors, and we do that again by a frame by frame manipulation of erasing the background around them. Once we've done that, we can isolate the Marshmallow Man's foot, and that's the same process, frame by frame manipulation of erasing the background. Now when it comes to seeing the windows through the leg itself, there are a number of ways we could tackle this. We could either airbrush each frame, but that is probably not the best way, because there will be inconsistencies with the airbrush against the shadows that naturally form in the shot. So one technique, and probably the most effective technique that we've found, is to take our background plate and we can turn it into a negative. So all the light areas become slightly dark and all the dark areas become extremely bright. And then this can be used as an overlay using a blending option called soft light. And what that will do is, where there's dark shadows of the window frames on the Marshmallow Man's leg, if we overlay this at an opacity of 0 and then start bringing the opacity up, there'll be a point where it will nicely blend out those shadowed areas on the leg, and the end result, although not perfect, is certainly an improvement on the original. So thank you for watching. We're Double O Productions. We hope you've enjoyed the video, and we have now reinstated all these new, corrected and updated shots into the film itself, and that's almost ready. Any suggestions, please make a comment and we'll happily take them on board, and I don't know, maybe you can suggest the next film that we need to repair. Okay, thank you for watching.